The desert heat shimmered like molten glass, every grain of sand reflecting the merciless sun above. She was smaller than the others, her frame lean and wiry, and to most of the hardened men around her, she looked like someone who had no business being there. They were Navy SEALs, Marines, men who had carried rucksacks through swamps and deserts, who measured strength by how many push-ups you could force out after a sleepless night. When they saw her step forward, the whispers began. Some smirked, others shook their heads. One officer, a SEAL with the kind of swagger only years of combat tours could carve into a man's bones, let out a chuckle that was loud enough for everyone to hear. "She's not making it through 5 miles, let alone 15, he scoffed. His words rolled over the group like a challenge, and the others, perhaps unwilling to voice doubt themselves, allowed his remark to hang heavy in the air. But she didn't flinch. Her eyes, a shade of brown that carried storms inside them, fixed on the weapon laid before her, the Barrett M82, a .50 caliber rifle that weighed more than most of the ammunition crates stacked in the shade of the Humvees. Her hands, calloused from years of quiet, unseen labor, reached down and lifted the rifle. At first, the weight seemed impossible. The steel was cold, unforgiving, every ounce a reminder that this was a machine designed not for show but for absolute destruction. It was the kind of weapon that could pierce through walls, vehicles, and bodies with equal ease, the kind of weapon that demanded respect even from the most seasoned warriors. She adjusted her grip, her muscles taut, and in that instant, silence rippled through the ranks. No one laughed now, but disbelief still colored their stares. She hoisted the rifle onto her shoulder, straightened her back, and without a single word, stepped into the sand. 15 miles. The distance mocked her from the horizon, a cruel reminder that even men twice her size dreaded this march. Yet step by step, she began to move, each foot sinking into the desert as though the earth itself wanted to test her resolve. The first mile was easy for everyone. The men walked with confidence, shoulders loose, rifles slung like toys compared to the steel beast she carried. But she never once looked at them. Her gaze was fixed ahead, and her breathing fell into a rhythm that matched the pounding of her boots in the sand. By the 3rd mile, the whispers returned. Sweat poured down her face, soaking her shirt, sticking the fabric to her skin. Her hands trembled slightly, not from weakness but from the sheer strain of balancing the rifle against her body with every step. Still she did not falter. When one of the Marines offered to take the weapon, just for a bit, she shook her head, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. That smile silenced him. It wasn't arrogance, it was a quiet refusal to surrender what she had chosen to carry. By the 5th mile, men began to feel the weight of their own burdens. Packs dug into their shoulders, boots blistered their heels, and the unrelenting sun sapped their strength. Yet she marched on, her steps steady, the Barrett resting against her like it belonged there. The officer who had laughed earlier kept glancing her way, irritation and curiosity warring on his face. He had seen men collapse in this desert. He had seen stronger recruits break down long before 15 miles. But this woman, this slip of a figure, walked as though the sand was her ally, as though the rifle was not a punishment but a promise she intended to fulfill. By the 7th mile, the desert turned cruel. Wind kicked up, blasting sand into their faces, into their mouths, into their lungs. Men cursed and pulled scarves tighter, but she simply lowered her chin and pressed forward. Her eyes narrowed against the storm, her steps never slowing. Inside her chest, her heart hammered with a mix of exhaustion and defiance. Every mocking word from the campfire the night before, every sneer, every doubt that had followed her since the day she stepped into this world of hardened men, fueled her. She wasn't just carrying the Barrett. She was carrying years of being told she was too small, too weak, too insignificant. Every pound of steel on her shoulder was proof she had something to prove, and she would not let it drop. By mile 10, the group was scattered, strung out across the dunes like broken pieces of a formation that had started strong but was now unraveling under the desert's weight. A few had stopped, kneeling in the sand, their breaths ragged. The medics checked them quickly, marking who could continue and who was done. But she kept moving. Her pace never quickened, never slowed. It was the kind of rhythm only someone who understood pain could master. Not the sudden pain of injury, but the long, grinding ache that burrows into the body and refuses to leave. She had known that ache all her life, and so she welcomed it now, wearing it like armor. At mile 12, the officer approached her. He had been watching, waiting, convinced that eventually she would stumble, that he would get the satisfaction of seeing her pride crush her beneath the Barrett's weight. But now, walking beside her, he saw something in her eyes that unsettled him. It wasn't desperation. It wasn't fear. It was focus. She glanced at him once, no word spoken, and in that glance, he felt the sting of his own arrogance. The desert didn't care about his rank, his reputation, or his years of service. The desert cared only about will, and in that moment he realized hers was stronger than his own. By the 14th mile, every step was a battle. Her legs screamed, her shoulders burned, and her vision blurred from the heat. But she never let the rifle drop. The Barrett clung to her like a shadow, its cold metal pressed against her skin, reminding her of the promise she had made to herself before the march began. She would finish. Not for the officer, not for the men, not even for the whispers that had followed her into this desert. She would finish because quitting was something she had never allowed herself to do. In her mind, failure was a luxury others could afford, but not her. She had fought too hard, endured too much to let go now. When she finally reached the 15th mile marker, the silence was absolute. The men who had doubted her, the ones who had laughed, could only stare as she lowered the Barrett from her shoulder and placed it gently in the sand. Her body trembled, sweat drenched her clothes, and her breaths came like fire, but her back was still straight. She had not broken. The SEAL officer, the one who had dismissed her so easily, stepped forward. For a long moment he said nothing, his jaw tight, his pride warring with the respect clawing its way into his chest. Finally, with a voice stripped of mockery, he muttered, "No one should have been able to carry that. No one but you." She looked at him, eyes still sharp despite the exhaustion, and for the first time since the march began she spoke. Her voice was quiet, steady, but it cut through the desert air like the crack of the Barrett itself. "You were right. No one can. But I'm not no one." The desert march ended, but for her the true test was only beginning. The Barrett rested on the sand like a sleeping beast, its black frame glinting under the dying sun. The men gathered around, some wiping sweat from their brows, others shaking their heads in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. But the SEAL officer, the one who had mocked her earlier, wasn't done. Pride doesn't die easily, and his was too thick, too ingrained to let her victory pass without a challenge. He stepped forward, his boots sinking slightly into the hot ground, his eyes locked on hers. "Carrying it is one thing," he said, voice calm but edged with steel. "But no one, can hit a target with that at this distance." He pointed toward a cluster of makeshift targets placed far out in the desert. The distance was so great it looked impossible to most eyes. The wind shifted, carrying grains of sand like tiny knives. Even seasoned marksmen struggled against such conditions. His words carried the same weight as his earlier laughter, but this time the men around him weren't smiling. They wanted to see if she would take the bait. She didn't hesitate. With slow precision, she crouched beside the Barrett, her fingers brushing along its frame as though reacquainting herself with an old friend. She checked the scope, adjusted the bipod, and lowered her body into position. Her movements weren't rushed. They were deliberate, each motion revealing that she wasn't approaching this as a dare but as a duty. The officer crossed his arms, smirk tugging at his lips, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. He had seen expert snipers fold under pressure, had seen men with years of training miss shots when the wind shifted or when fatigue clouded their judgment. But she lay prone in the sand, her cheek pressed to the rifle, her breathing slowing until it seemed she had merged with the weapon itself. The world around her faded, the whispers, the doubts, the burning sun. All that remained was the scope's narrow circle and the distant target dancing at the edge of the horizon. The first shot shattered the silence. The Barrett roared like thunder, its recoil kicking back against her shoulder with brutal force. Dust erupted around her, the shockwave rolling through the men who stood behind, unprepared for the sheer violence of the weapon's voice. Through the scope she saw the target jerk, a clean hit dead center. The officer's smirk faltered. One shot could be luck, he told himself, clinging to disbelief like a lifeline. But she wasn't finished. She chambered another round, her movements smooth, unshaken by the recoil that left most shooters bruised. She adjusted for wind, calculated the distance not with instruments but with instinct, with experience carved into her from countless unseen hours of practice. The second shot rang out, another explosion of fire and force, and the second target split, torn through with merciless precision. Now the murmurs rose. Men leaned forward, eyes wide, watching as she lined up the third shot. Her body was still, her mind silent. The desert seemed to hold its breath with her. Then the Barrett roared again and the third target fell. 3 shots, 3 kills, each one at a distance that made even seasoned marksmen doubt themselves. She exhaled slowly, lowering her head for a moment, not in exhaustion but in calm. Around her, the silence deepened. The SEAL officer's arms dropped to his sides, his chest rising and falling as though the desert heat had suddenly grown heavier. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His certainty had been torn apart, stripped by the thunder of a rifle wielded by someone he had dismissed as too small, too weak, too insignificant. She stood, brushing sand from her clothes, her eyes never leaving his. "You said no one could hit that," she said softly. "And maybe no one can. But I'm not no one." Her words echoed the ones she had spoken after the march, but this time they carried even more weight. They weren't just defiance. They were truth carved into the air, undeniable and unshakable. The men around them didn't cheer, didn't shout. Instead, they watched in a silence that was heavier than any applause. Respect doesn't roar. It settles quietly, deep and enduring, and in that moment, every soldier present felt it. The officer finally found his voice, though it came low, quieter than anyone expected. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" he asked. It wasn't a challenge anymore. It was curiosity, tinged with something he hadn't allowed himself to feel toward her until now: respect. She looked at the Barrett, then back at him. "You learn a lot when the world doesn't expect you to survive," she replied. Her answer carried the weight of unspoken history, the kind that couldn't be explained in neat sentences. Years of hardship, of being overlooked, of being underestimated, had sharpened her into something steel-like, unbreakable. And in that crucible, she had taught herself what others insisted she could never know. As the sun dipped lower, painting the desert in gold and blood red, the exercise ended. The men packed their gear, but their glances kept straying back to her. They didn't look at her with disbelief anymore, nor with the dismissive pity they had carried earlier. They looked at her the way soldiers look at someone who has proven themselves in a place where proving yourself matters more than rank, more than words. Some gave small nods, acknowledgments that spoke more than congratulations ever could. The officer lingered, his pride still aching, but something deeper stirring within him. He wasn't the kind of man to admit he was wrong easily, but he knew when he had been beaten. More importantly, he knew when someone had earned a place beside him. Later that night, as the campfire crackled and the desert cold replaced the brutal heat, he found himself sitting across from her. No mockery now, no smugness. Just a man who had spent his life believing strength looked one way, and a woman who had shown him it could look another. "You know," he said quietly, "I've seen a lot of good shots. A lot of strong men. But what you did today, that was something else." She didn't answer right away. She stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in her eyes, and then finally she spoke. "Strength isn't about size," she said. "It's about not letting go when everyone else thinks you should." Her voice was steady, not boastful, just honest. And in that honesty he felt a shift, something breaking free inside him, the realization that maybe, just maybe, he had as much to learn from her as she had to prove to him. The desert night was long, and the stars scattered above them like shards of glass. The camp quieted, but the memory of the day lingered, etched into the minds of every man present. Tomorrow would bring new trials, new challenges, but the image of her carrying the Barrett across 15 miles of sand and then bending its thunder to her will would remain. The officer leaned back, exhaling slowly, his earlier arrogance gone. For the first time, he saw her not as the small frame who had no place among them, but as a warrior who had carved her place with every step, every shot, every breath. And though he would never admit it aloud, he knew that if the day came when his life depended on one perfect shot across an impossible distance, she was the one he would trust to take it. The mission came without warning, as most of them did. One moment, the camp was quiet, filled with the low murmur of men tending to weapons and cleaning gear. The next, the crackle of the radio cut through the silence, sharp and urgent. A convoy had been ambushed 20 miles north, pinned down by insurgents on the ridge lines. Intelligence reported heavy machine guns dug into the rocks, snipers hidden among the ruins of an abandoned village, and IEDs laced across the only road. The situation was deteriorating by the minute. Reinforcements were thin, too far to intervene quickly. The call had gone out. A small strike team would move fast, hit hard, and break the ambush before the convoy was wiped out. She listened without speaking, her hands tightening on the strap of her pack. She knew before anyone said it that the Barrett would be needed. And she knew just as clearly that no one else would carry it. The officer who had once mocked her stood at the center of the briefing, his voice steady, clipped, professional. He didn't waste words, didn't sugarcoat the danger. "We take the ridges, we find their eyes, we cut them out," he said. Every man understood what that meant. Without the snipers, the convoy had no chance. She watched him, her face expressionless, but when his gaze flicked toward her, there was no mockery now. There was only a silent acknowledgement. He knew who would carry the Barrett, who would be the sharp edge in this fight. You didn't need to say it. She simply stepped forward, the rifle already slung across her back. No one argued, no one doubted. What she had done in the desert had silenced every voice that might have risen against her. They moved under the cover of darkness, the desert transformed by night into a vast, cold sea of shadows. The sand that had blistered their feet by day now crunched under boots with a brittle sound, the air biting at their faces. The team advanced in silence, each man a shadow among shadows, their weapons glinting faintly in the pale light of the moon. She felt the weight of the Barrett pressing against her spine, heavy but familiar, no longer a burden but an extension of her own will. The climb toward the ridges was brutal. Loose rock shifted underfoot, the incline steep and treacherous. More than once, men slipped, catching themselves on jagged stone, but she pressed upward, her pace steady, her breathing controlled. The Barrett clung to her like an anchor, but she carried it as she had carried it through the desert, with unyielding resolve. When they reached the ridge line, the sounds of battle rose like a storm. Machine guns hammered in the distance, tracer rounds cutting through the night like burning arrows. The convoy below was lit by sporadic flashes of gunfire, vehicles burning, men scrambling for cover. Through her scope, she saw the enemy positions, silhouettes crouched behind rocks, muzzle flashes sparking from the ruined buildings, rifles trained downward. The officer crouched beside her, pointing toward a cluster of shadows perched high above the road. "Snipers," he muttered. "3 of them. They're the ones keeping the convoy pinned. We need them gone." She nodded once, adjusted her position, and lowered her cheek to the stock of the Barrett. The world narrowed to the scope's glass, to the shifting winds and the rhythm of her breath. Her finger tightened on the trigger and the Barrett roared. The recoil slammed against her, the shockwave rattling the rocks, but her aim was true. The first sniper crumpled, his body tumbling backward into the shadows. She adjusted instantly, chambering another round, the second shot tearing through the night, silencing another muzzle flash. The third sniper had barely shifted position before her scope found him. The Barrett thundered again and he was gone. 3 shots, 3 kills. The ridges fell silent, the enemy's eyes cut out as promised. Below, the convoy stirred, soldiers using the brief reprieve to regroup, to fire back, to push against the ambush that had threatened to swallow them whole. But the fight wasn't over. From the ruins of the village, heavier fire erupted, machine guns sweeping across the ridge, bullets sparking against stone. The officer swore, ducking low. "They know where we are," he barked. "We've got to move." But she didn't move. Her scope swept across the village, searching, calculating. And then she saw it, a mounted heavy gun tearing through the convoy, its operator shielded behind sandbags and concrete. The Barrett wasn't made for speed, it was made for power, for ending threats that no other weapon could touch. She adjusted, exhaled, and fired. The shot punched through the sandbags, through the man behind them, through the weapon itself. The machine gun fell silent, its operator collapsing in a heap. The convoy below roared to life, soldiers surging forward, their morale renewed by the sudden shift. The officer glanced at her, his eyes wide in the moonlight. "Hell of a shot," he muttered, but she was already adjusting again, her scope sweeping for the next threat. She wasn't thinking about praise, about proving herself, not anymore. She was thinking about the men below, about the lives strung out across the desert floor, each one depending on her precision, her will, her refusal to let go. Her world had narrowed to targets and timing, to the rhythm of her breath and the steady thunder of the Barrett. Each shot was a promise kept, each enemy silenced, a proof that she belonged here, that she was needed here. The battle stretched on, minutes dragging like hours, the desert filled with fire and fury. But one by one, the enemy positions crumbled under the relentless push of the convoy and the unerring thunder from the ridge. When the last shot echoed into silence, the night seemed to exhale. The convoy was alive, battered but intact, its survivors looking upward, toward the unseen hand that had cut the eyes from their enemy. On the ridge, she lowered the Barrett, her arms trembling now, exhaustion flooding in as the adrenaline ebbed. Her body ached, her shoulder bruised from the recoil, but her gaze was steady. The officer moved to her side, crouching low, his face lit by the faint glow of burning wreckage below. He didn't speak at first. He just looked at her, as though trying to find words heavy enough to carry what he felt. Finally he said, "You didn't just prove me wrong. You saved them all." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The proof lay in the silence of the ridge, in the stillness of the battlefield below, in the lives that had walked out of an ambush because she had refused to miss. She slung the Barrett over her shoulder once more, the familiar weight pressing against her spine, and began the long walk back down. The men followed, their steps slower, their glances toward her filled with something that no desert march, no firing range, no words could ever give: trust. And in the officer's eyes, for the first time, there was no doubt, no pride, no lingering shadow of disbelief. There was only respect, the kind that can only be earned in fire, in blood, in the thunder of a rifle that no one believed she could carry, let alone master. The ridge victory had earned her silence-breaking respect, but the desert never gave breathing room for long. Days later, orders came for a mission unlike the others. This time, the team wouldn't just be supporting a convoy or breaking an ambush. They would be sent deep into enemy territory, tasked with dismantling a weapons cache buried beneath the remains of an old fortress, a place that had been fought over for generations and left in ruin more times than anyone could count. Intelligence warned of heavy defenses, tunnels riddled with explosives, and insurgent fighters who knew the terrain as if it were stitched into their skin. The officer stood before the team, briefing them with his usual clipped precision, but his eyes lingered on her longer now, not in doubt but in a recognition of necessity. The Barrett wasn't optional this time, it was essential. And she, whether anyone admitted it aloud or not, was the one who had to carry it. They moved at dawn, the horizon painted in hues of blood and fire, the desert air heavy with silence that promised violence. The fortress loomed in the distance, jagged stone walls half collapsed but still formidable, casting long shadows across the sand. She adjusted the strap of the Barrett across her shoulder, her body already remembering the pain it would bring, the way every step would dig the rifle's weight deeper into her bones. But she didn't flinch. Pain was an old companion, and she carried it as she carried the rifle, without hesitation. The men around her glanced often in her direction, not out of disbelief anymore, but in quiet reassurance, as though her presence steadied their nerves. Even the officer, once her sharpest critic, now walked closer, his silence carrying the weight of unspoken trust. As they closed in on the fortress, the first shots rang out. Bullets tore across the sand, kicking up dust, snapping into stone. The team scattered for cover, returning fire with disciplined bursts. She dropped to the ground, the Barrett sliding into position as though it had been waiting for this moment. Through the scope, she saw the muzzle flashes from the fortress walls, insurgents firing from behind crumbling battlements. Her fingers squeezed the trigger and the Barrett thundered. One flash vanished. She adjusted, fired again, another enemy silenced. The battlefield cracked alive around her, but inside her scope, there was only order, only targets waiting to be erased. The officer's voice barked through the radio, directing movements, calling positions, but even he couldn't ignore how her shots shaped the fight. With each pull of the trigger, a hole opened in the enemy's defense, a gap for the team to press forward. They advanced in bursts, moving from cover to cover, the Barrett's thunder clearing the way. She felt the recoil slam against her shoulder again and again, bruises blooming beneath her skin, but she welcomed the pain. Pain meant she was still fighting. Pain meant she was still alive. And with every shot, with every body that fell from the fortress walls, she carved a path for the men beside her. They reached the base of the fortress as the sun climbed higher, the heat rising like a physical weight pressing against their bodies. The walls loomed above them, broken but defiant, riddled with shadows that could hide any number of rifles. The officer signaled the climb. Rope lines were set, grappling hooks thrown, and one by one the men began their ascent. She slung the Barrett across her back, the weight nearly tearing her from the wall as she climbed, fingers digging into ancient stone. Her muscles screamed, her breath tore through her lungs, but she didn't stop. Every inch upward was another chance to fall, another chance for the weight to drag her down, but she kept climbing. She had carried the Barrett through 15 miles of sand. She had carried it through fire and fury. She would carry it up this wall even if it ripped her body apart. They reached the top under a hail of gunfire, insurgents pouring out from hidden passages, their rifles blazing. The battle turned brutal, close quarters, knives and rifles colliding in a storm of blood and grit. She dropped to one knee, the Barrett sliding back into position, and began tearing through the enemy at close range, each shot a hammer blow that shattered bodies and broke defenses. The fortress trembled under the assault, stone crumbling, dust filling the air. The officer fought beside her, his movements sharp, efficient, deadly, but even he knew the tide turned with every thunderous crack of the Barrett. It wasn't just a rifle anymore. It was judgment, and she was its hand. Deeper into the fortress they found the tunnels. Dark, narrow, suffocating, the air thick with the scent of explosives and old death. The men hesitated. One misstep could trigger the charges, bring the entire place down on their heads. But hesitation wasn't in her nature. She moved first, the Barrett dragging against the walls in the tight space, every step a struggle, but she refused to set it down. Her eyes scanned the shadows, her instincts sharp, every muscle taut with focus. In the silence of the tunnels, her mind flickered back to the officer's words from days before. No one can do it. And again she answered them in silence. I'm not no one. They reached the heart of the fortress, where crates of weapons and ammunition were stacked like a mountain, guarded by men who had no intention of letting them leave alive. The firefight that followed was chaos incarnate, bullets ripping through the dark, grenades exploding in confined spaces, the air filled with fire and screams. She anchored herself, the Barrett kicking against her shoulder as she tore through enemy after enemy, her shots cutting down threats before they could raise their rifles. The officer shouted commands, the men pressed forward, but every eye turned again and again toward her, toward the woman whose small frame carried the thunder of gods in her hands. When the last insurgent fell, the silence in the tunnels was deafening. The team moved quickly, setting charges, preparing to destroy the cache. Time was short. They had minutes to escape before the explosives would bring the fortress crashing down. They ran, stumbling through smoke and dust, their bodies battered, their lungs burning. She ran with them, the Barrett still across her back, dragging at her with every step. The fortress shook behind them, stones splitting, walls collapsing, fire blooming in the night. They burst out into the desert as the explosion ripped the sky apart, the fortress crumbling into ruin, the weapons gone forever. They stood there, bent over, gasping, their faces lit by the inferno behind them. No one spoke at first. The mission was done, the objective complete, but words felt too small for what had just passed. The officer turned to her, his face streaked with dust and sweat, his eyes locking onto hers. He didn't speak, not immediately. He just gave a slow nod, a gesture heavy with meaning. Not acknowledgement, not even gratitude. Something deeper, recognition. She had carried the Barrett into hell and brought them all back out. And in that silence, in the glow of fire and ruin, every man knew the truth. She wasn't just one of them anymore. She was the reason they were still alive. The desert wind howled across the ruins long after the fortress had collapsed into dust, carrying with it the acrid stench of smoke and burned stone. The team sat scattered in the shadows of a rocky outcrop, their bodies bruised, their nerves frayed, but alive. For soldiers, survival was victory, and yet, as they cleaned their rifles and bandaged wounds, they kept stealing glances at her. The Barrett lay across her knees, its frame scarred and blackened from the fight, yet still intact, still alive in a way that made it feel less like a weapon and more like an extension of her soul. She ran a cloth along its barrel in silence, her hands steady despite the tremors of exhaustion that ran through her arms. No one spoke to her directly. Respect had sealed their lips, but curiosity burned in their eyes. Who was she, this woman who carried the impossible? What fire lived inside her that no desert, no fortress, no battlefield could extinguish? The officer sat nearest, his back against the stone, his gaze fixed on her with a weight that wasn't challenge anymore but something closer to wonder. He had led men through wars, had seen them break and bend, had buried more brothers than he cared to remember. Yet none of them, none, had carried themselves the way she did. Finally, unable to hold the question back, he spoke. Why? His voice was low, rough, but it cut through the crackle of the campfire. She lifted her head slowly, her eyes meeting his. Why what? She asked, though her tone suggested she already knew what he meant. He gestured toward the Barrett, toward the scars on her arms, the bruises blooming beneath her sleeves. Why do you push past what anyone else would stop at? Why carry something that should break you? His words weren't accusations, not anymore. They were questions born of disbelief, of respect that demanded understanding. For a long moment she didn't answer. The fire popped, sparks drifting into the desert night, the silence stretching taut between them. Then finally she spoke, her voice quiet, steady, but carrying the weight of years unspoken. Because I've been carrying weight my whole life. This, she touched the Barrett, is the first weight I chose. Her words hung in the air, heavy and cryptic, and the officer leaned forward, his curiosity sharpened. She didn't look at him as she continued, her gaze fixed on the fire as if it showed her memories she wished she could burn away. I grew up in a place where survival wasn't guaranteed. Not because of war, not at first, but because life itself seemed determined to crush us. My father drank himself into rage, my mother was too broken to fight him, and I was small. Easy to overlook. Easy to hurt. I learned early that no one was going to save me. That if I wanted to keep breathing, I had to be stronger than anyone expected. Her voice wavered, but only slightly, the cracks buried under iron. I carried my little brother on my back through nights when we had no heat, no food. I carried him when the beatings left him too weak to walk. I carried him to school every day, even when kids laughed, even when teachers looked at me with pity instead of respect. I carried him because no one else would. And when he died, when the sickness took him because we couldn't afford the medicine, I carried that too. Her hand tightened on the Barrett, her knuckles white against the black steel. So when people tell me this rifle is too heavy, that the miles are too far, that the shots are too impossible, they don't understand. I've been carrying heavier things my entire life. This is just steel. Steel I can master. Steel I can make obey. The firelight flickered against her face, revealing the storm that lived in her eyes. The men around the camp fell silent, their glances turning away, as though ashamed of listening to something too personal, too raw. But the officer didn't look away. His chest tightened with something he hadn't expected to feel, guilt, yes, for mocking her once, but also admiration that bordered on reverence. She wasn't driven by pride or the hunger to prove herself. She was driven by ghosts, by the weight of a past that had carved her into steel long before the Barrett ever touched her hands. And in that revelation he understood. She didn't carry the rifle because she had something to prove to them. She carried it because it was the only thing in this world that made sense, the only weight that felt honest, the only burden that gave back when she shouldered it. She looked up then, meeting his gaze directly, her expression calm but unyielding. I fight because it's the only way I know to keep from breaking. Out here, with this weapon, I can make the weight mean something. I can turn it into protection instead of punishment. That's the difference. That's why I don't stop. Her words weren't loud, weren't dramatic, but they landed harder than any thunderous speech could have. The officer swallowed, his throat dry, and gave the smallest nod. For the first time in years, he felt humbled not by rank, not by combat, but by truth spoken in the voice of someone he had once dismissed. He realized then that no matter how many battles he had fought, he had never known strength like hers. The strength to carry a life of suffering and still stand, still fight, still refuse to let go. The camp settled into silence after that, each man lost in his thoughts. The fire burned low, the desert cold creeping in, but she remained still, her hand resting on the Barrett as though drawing warmth not from the flames but from the weapon itself. She didn't seek comfort, didn't ask for sympathy. She had carried her story the way she carried everything else, alone, without complaint. And now, though she hadn't meant to, she had shared it, placing that weight in the open air where others could finally see it. For the officer, the realization was like a wound and a gift all at once. He had misjudged her, mocked her, underestimated her, and yet she had saved his life, saved all their lives, not just with the rifle but with the strength born from a life he couldn't begin to imagine. Hours later, as the stars wheeled across the desert sky, the officer found himself unable to sleep. He kept replaying her words, her steady voice, the way her eyes had glowed like embers as she spoke of carrying her brother, of carrying pain that no one should have to bear. He understood now why she never faltered, why she never surrendered the Barrett even when her body screamed for relief. For her, quitting wasn't weakness, it was betrayal, betrayal of everything she had carried, everything she had lost. And so she carried on because to stop would mean letting the weight crush her completely. He looked over at her where she slept lightly beside the rifle, her body curled around it as though it were both shield and anchor. For the first time he felt something he hadn't felt for a long time on any battlefield. Not just respect, not just admiration, but faith. Faith that as long as she carried the Barrett, as long as she breathed, no battle was truly lost. The next mission came sooner than anyone expected. There was no time for rest, no time for the bruises to heal or the wounds to knit. The radio call snapped them awake in the dead of night, urgency crackling through every word. A platoon had been ambushed in the canyons, trapped on the high ground with dwindling supplies and mounting casualties. The enemy wasn't just better armed this time. They had taken the cliffs, raining fire from above, pinning the soldiers in a kill zone that grew tighter with every passing hour. Reinforcements couldn't reach them in time. It would fall to her team, and once again it would fall to her rifle. The Barrett was more than just a weapon now, it was the only hope of leveling the battlefield. She felt the weight of that truth settle on her shoulders as surely as the rifle itself, heavier than it had ever been. For the first time she wondered if her strength would hold. They moved quickly, their silhouettes blending into the black teeth of the canyon walls. The officer led, his hand raised in silent signals, his eyes sharp despite the exhaustion that clung to all of them. She followed, the Barrett dragging across her back, every step a reminder of how much her body had already endured. Her shoulder was bruised deep from the fortress fight, her arms ached from days of unrelenting strain, and the ghosts of her past still weighed heavily in her chest. She tried to quiet her thoughts, to sink into the rhythm of her breath as she always did, But this time, doubt whispered louder than the desert wind. She had carried her brother until the day she couldn't. She had carried pain until it carved her hollow. What if this was the mission where the weight finally broke her? The climb into the canyon was brutal. Loose rocks shifted under every step, threatening to send them tumbling into the black void below. The cliffs towered above like jagged fangs, the enemy somewhere in those shadows, watching, waiting. Her breath came harder now, her muscles trembling under the strain of the Barrett. Each step upward was slower than the last, and though she clenched her jaw and forced her body forward, she felt the creeping edge of something she had never allowed herself before: weakness. Behind her, one of the younger soldiers reached up as if to steady her, to offer help. She shot him a look sharp enough to stop him cold. She didn't need his pity. She couldn't afford it. Because if she let even 1 ounce of the weight slip, if she accepted even a hand for support, she would betray everything she had told herself, everything she had told them. She couldn't be helped. She had to endure. They reached a ledge overlooking the canyon floor, and there the battle unfolded in fire and thunder. The trapped platoon huddled behind smoldering vehicles, their rifles spitting desperately upward while enemy machine guns tore down from above. Tracer fire painted the night in arcs of red and green, the cliffs alive with death. The officer dropped beside her, pointing to the flashes high on the ridge. "That's where they're dug in," he said, his voice barely audible over the roar. "You're the only one who can reach them." She nodded, though her arms trembled as she brought the Barrett into position. Through the scope, the enemy's nest came into view. Sandbags, a heavy gun mounted behind cover, shadows moving quickly as they reloaded and fired. She adjusted, drew in a ragged breath and fired. The Barrett thundered, the recoil tearing through her shoulder like fire. The round slammed into the nest, ripping a hole through the sandbags, through the man behind them. She shifted, fired again, and another body fell. The platoon below surged, their voices rising in renewed hope as the pressure from above lessened. But the enemy wasn't idle. Muzzle flashes erupted from another angle, bullets sparking against the rocks where she lay. She adjusted, but her arms shook as she tried to steady the rifle. Her vision blurred, sweat stinging her eyes. She blinked hard, forced herself to breathe, forced the doubt back into its corner. Again she squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared and another enemy fell. The fight tilted, just barely but enough. Then the return fire found them. A burst of rounds shredded the stone inches from her head, shards cutting across her cheek. She flinched, instinctively pressing lower into the rock. For a heartbeat, her hands slackened on the Barrett. Her mind flashed, unbidden, to her brother's face, small, fragile, fading in her arms as she carried him through nights of hunger and pain. She had failed to save him. What if this was the same? What if all her carrying ended the same way, with weight too heavy, with loss she couldn't stop? Her chest heaved, her grip faltered. For the first time since she had lifted the Barrett, she felt the temptation to set it down. The officer's voice cut through her storm, sharp and steady. "They need you. Right now." She looked at him, his face grim, his eyes locked on hers. He wasn't mocking, wasn't ordering. He was reminding. She tore her gaze back to the scope, her finger finding the trigger again. The doubt didn't vanish, but she swallowed it, forced it down, the way she had forced down hunger, pain, fear her whole life. The Barrett roared, the recoil ripping through her body, but the shot was true. The heavy gun on the ridge shattered, its operator thrown back in a spray of dust and stone. The trapped platoon surged forward, their rifles spitting with new fury, the enemy line cracking. Shot after shot, she dragged the Barrett's thunder across the cliffs, silencing one nest after another, her body screaming with every recoil, every breath. Her shoulder felt like shattered glass, her arms numb, but still she fired. Below, the platoon broke free, charging through the canyon, their shouts echoing as the enemy scattered. The tide turned, slowly, painfully but unmistakably. And when the last enemy broke and fled into the night, silence rolled over the canyon like a wave. The only sound left was the ragged breathing of survivors. She lowered the Barrett, her arms trembling so violently she thought they might give way. Her body slumped against the stone, her chest heaving, her face pale with exhaustion. The officer crouched beside her, his hand gripping her shoulder, not steadying, not pitying, but anchoring. "You almost quit," he said quietly, not as an accusation but as an acknowledgement. She closed her eyes, swallowed hard. "I thought I couldn't carry it any more," she whispered. He shook his head, his grip tightening. "You didn't quit. That's the only thing that matters." They descended the cliffs in silence, the canyon still smoldering behind them. She carried the Barrett still, though it dragged at her like never before, every step agony. But she didn't let it fall. She couldn't. Because in that canyon for the first time she had faced the possibility of breaking, and she had kept walking anyway. And maybe that, more than any perfect shot, was what made her different. Not that she never doubted, but that she carried the weight even when doubt screamed the loudest. The dawn that followed brought no peace. The sky bled orange over the desert, casting long shadows across the jagged earth, but the air was heavy, tight, as if even the rising sun hesitated to bring warmth to men and women so wrung thin. They had barely staggered back from the canyon when new orders came, harsher than any before. Intelligence had confirmed a convoy carrying heavy weaponry, rockets and explosives bound for insurgent cells deep in the mountains. If the convoy reached its destination, entire villages and Allied outposts would be obliterated. Conventional airstrikes were impossible. The convoy had woven itself through narrow passes too treacherous for aircraft to reach. Which meant it would be her and the rifle again, one final test in terrain that devoured the unprepared. She felt the words slam into her chest harder than any recoil. There was no time to rest, no space for weakness. Her body was wrecked, her mind fraying at the edges, but the weight of the mission left her no choice. If she faltered now, it would not just be her team who paid, it would be hundreds of lives, entire families. The officer pulled her aside before they set out. His face was grave, lined by fatigue but sharpened with certainty. "You understand," he said, his voice low, "this isn't like the last mission. This isn't just holding ground. We'll be outnumbered, cut off, no backup. If you can't make the shots, we die. If you can't carry that weapon, none of us come home." His words weren't cruel but stripped of comfort, heavy with the unvarnished truth. She met his gaze, and though her insides churned with fear, though every nerve in her body screamed for relief, she nodded. Because in that moment she understood something she hadn't before. This wasn't about proving herself anymore, wasn't about silencing the laughter or the doubt. This was about carrying until she couldn't. For all of them. Even if it broke her in the end, she would carry until the last step. The march to the mountains was grueling beyond words. The desert gave way to jagged ridges that clawed at boots and tore skin. The air grew thinner as they climbed, every breath scraping her lungs raw. The Barrett seemed to double in weight with each incline, the strap cutting deeper into her bruised shoulder. Her muscles spasmed in protest, her legs shook, but she refused to slow. She remembered her brother, small and fragile in her arms, remembered nights when her own body had begged her to stop, to lay him down, to rest. But she hadn't then and she wouldn't now. She could almost hear his voice in her memory, not words but the steady beat of his trust, the way he had leaned on her without fear. She carried that too, the invisible weight of a promise she had never spoken but had always kept. To never let go while she still had strength to stand. They reached an outcropping overlooking the pass just as the convoy snaked into view. Trucks armored with steel plates, men bristling with rifles clinging to their sides, the rumble of engines echoing like thunder through the canyon walls. It was a sight meant to intimidate, to crush hope before battle even began. The officer crouched beside her, eyes locked on the targets. "This is it," he murmured. "We hit the lead and rear trucks, trap them in the pass. Then we cut them down before they know what's happening. You're the only one who can do it." She nodded, her hands trembling as she set the Barrett on its bipod, adjusted the scope and steadied her breath. Through the glass, the world narrowed to her and the convoy, the trucks crawling closer, closer. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might throw her off balance, but she pressed her cheek to the stock, whispered to herself the same words she always had when the weight felt impossible. One breath, one step, one shot. The first round roared, echoing off the cliffs like a god's hammer. The lead truck exploded into fire, shrapnel slicing through the convoy. Panic erupted below, men shouting, scrambling for cover. She shifted, fired again, and the rear truck burst into flames, boxing the rest in tight. The pass became a cage and she was its keeper. The Barrett thundered again and again, each shot tearing into steel, into flesh, into the fragile illusion of invincibility the convoy carried. The enemy scrambled to return fire, bullets sparking against the rocks where she lay, but her focus was absolute. Every time her body screamed at her to stop, every time the recoil shredded her shoulder, she remembered the trapped platoon, the fortress, the canyon. She remembered her brother. And she carried the rifle still. The firefight raged, her team joining in with rifles and grenades, turning the pass into a slaughter. Yet the enemy was relentless, pouring fire upward, pushing against the noose she had drawn around them. Dust and smoke choked the air, screams echoing through the canyon. Her scope blurred, her arms trembled so violently she thought she might drop the weapon, but she forced her muscles to obey, forced her finger to squeeze again. A gunner on the truck roof crumpled. Another fell as he tried to rally his men. The officer shouted orders, pulling the team into a tight rhythm, but always it came back to her, to the thunder of the Barrett holding the line. She was no longer a woman with a rifle. She was the rifle. She was the storm. And then came the breaking point. Her shoulder gave a sharp, searing crack as she fired, pain lancing down her arm so fierce she nearly blacked out. The Barrett slipped, nearly tumbling from her grip. She gasped, clutched at it desperately, terror flooding her chest. If she dropped it now, if she couldn't keep going, it would all unravel. She pressed her forehead against the scope, tears she hadn't meant to shed streaking her dust-caked face. For a heartbeat, she wanted to let go, to admit that she had carried enough, that the weight had finally won. But then she heard the officer's voice through the chaos, shouting not at her, but at the enemy, a roar of defiance that rang like steel. "You'll never break us." And in that cry she found her own. She dragged the Barrett back into position, ignoring the fire in her shoulder, ignoring the tremor in her bones, and fired again. The shot tore through the last mounted gun, silencing it forever. The convoy broke. The enemy scattered, some fleeing into the mountains, others throwing down their weapons in surrender. Smoke filled the pass, bodies lay broken in the dirt, and the silence that followed was the silence of victory. She slumped back, the Barrett heavy across her lap, her entire body trembling with exhaustion and pain. Her arms felt like lead, her shoulder numb, but she held the weapon still, refusing to let it slip. The officer crouched beside her, eyes fierce but softened now with something else, something like respect, something like awe. He didn't speak because there was nothing left to say. She had done what no one else could. She had carried the impossible again and again, until the impossible bent to her will. As the sun rose higher over the smoking pass, she looked down at the Barrett, at the steel beast that had nearly broken her. It was more than a rifle now, more than proof against mockery. It was the weight she had chosen, the burden she had claimed, the path she had carved with blood and fire. She had carried it through sand, through stone, through fear, through doubt. And still she carried it. She always would. The smoke from the canyon still clung to her clothes when they made their way back to base. The long trek down the mountain was quieter than any march they had made before, as though the silence itself was a tribute to what had been endured. Every step jarred her bruised shoulder, every breath burned her ribs, but she refused to fall behind. The Barrett was strapped to her back again, heavier than it had ever been, though now the weight felt almost sacred. She did not carry it because she had to, not anymore. She carried it because it was part of her, as much as her breath and heartbeat. Around her, the SEALs kept glancing her way, their eyes less skeptical now, less guarded. There was a gravity in their looks, the kind of wordless respect forged only in fire. For weeks she had endured their mockery, their doubts, their cutting whispers. But after the canyon, after the convoy, after all she had endured, none dared question her again. She had proven herself in the only way that mattered, under the roar of gunfire, when the cost of failure was death. When they reached base, word spread fast. She had not expected it, hadn't wanted it in truth, but soldiers had a way of finding stories, and her story was one they seized with hungry hands. In the mess hall, in the barracks, even in the motor pool where grease and sweat caked the air, the tale traveled. The tiny woman who had carried a Barrett M82 through 15 miles of sand. The one who had broken a siege with her shot. The one who had held the pass when no one else could. At first, hearing it unsettled her, made her retreat inward. She had not done these things for glory. She had done them because they had to be done. Yet she could not stop the stories from spreading, nor the faces that now turned toward her not with scorn, but with something close to reverence. She walked among them quietly, carrying her tray of food or her kit bag, and where before there had been smirks, there were now nods of respect. The officer sought her out not long after. They sat outside the barracks, the desert wind kicking dust across their boots. He said little at first, just sat beside her in silence, as though searching for words worthy of the moment. Finally he spoke. "I'll tell you something I should have told you before," he said, voice low. "I didn't believe in you. I thought you'd break. Thought you were a liability. I was wrong." He paused, looking out toward the horizon where the sun bled red against the sand. "I've led a lot of good men. I've lost a lot of them too. But what you did out there, it wasn't just courage. It was something beyond that. You carried us all. And I'll never forget it." She looked at him, unsure how to answer because she had never wanted thanks, never wanted words. But his voice carried weight, the kind that would echo long after the desert was behind them. She simply nodded because in truth she had nothing to add. She hadn't done it for him or for the platoon or for herself. She had done it because carrying was what she had always done. Weeks passed and missions blurred together, but the legend refused to fade. Letters began to arrive from soldiers she had never met, men and women scattered across distant outposts, who had heard whispers of her defiance and found strength in it. Some wrote of their own doubts, of the times they had been told they weren't enough. Others wrote of brothers, sisters, children they carried in memory, who gave them reason to keep walking when their bodies begged them to stop. She read those letters in quiet moments, and for the first time she understood that her story was no longer just her own. By carrying that rifle, she had carried something greater, the weight of every person who had ever been underestimated, mocked, or told they couldn't. She had given them proof that impossible was only a word, not a destiny. And yet, even as the legend grew, she never let herself believe she was invincible. Her body bore the scars of what she had endured. A shoulder that would never quite heal, ribs that ached in the cold nights where the recoil echoed through her bones until she woke gasping. But she accepted those wounds the same way she accepted the rifle's weight. They were reminders etched into her flesh, of what it meant to carry more than seemed possible. She trained still, ran still, lifted still, but always with that shadow of pain humming through her frame. Where another might have cursed it, she welcomed it, because the pain was proof. Proof that she had not broken. Proof that she had endured. There came a day when she was called before the higher command, summoned into a room thick with medals, maps, and men who spoke in measured tones. They questioned her about the missions, about the canyon and the convoy, their eyes sharp, their pens scratching across paper. She answered simply, with none of the embellishments that rumor had birthed. She told them only what was true, that she had carried, that she had fired, that she had done what had to be done. When the questions ended, one of the generals leaned forward. "You've done more than prove yourself," he said. "You've set a standard. Men twice your size have failed where you stood. Remember that." She saluted, accepted his words, but in her heart she held no pride. Because she knew pride could rot a soldier faster than doubt. What she carried was not pride, but purpose, and purpose could not be shaken. On her last night before redeployment, she found herself alone on the edge of the base, staring out at the desert that had tested her so fiercely. The stars stretched endless above, the same stars she had watched as a child, cradling her brother in the silence of their small home. She thought of him then, thought of how he would laugh if he knew his sister, the small one, the one so many had dismissed, had carried a rifle larger than her through hell itself. She smiled at the thought, a soft, tired smile, and for the first time in months she felt a weight lift. Because she understood now that she didn't carry alone. Every step, every shot, every burden had been carried with him, with the platoon, with every soldier who had stood beside her. And that was why she had never broken. The Barrett rested beside her, cleaned and oiled, its black steel gleaming faintly under the stars. She laid her hand on it, fingers tracing the cold metal. Once it had been the symbol of the impossible. Now it was the symbol of what she had overcome. She whispered into the night, voice soft enough that only the desert could hear, "I'll carry it as long as I have to." And the wind answered, rustling across the sand, as though promising that she would never carry alone again. The end.